When next I opened my eyes, I expected to find myself surrounded by the gray emptiness of the abyss as I awaited Icor's judgment, but I did not. A glance to my right revealed Sir Thomas's body lying next to me. I was not in the afterlife after all. Night had fallen, and I was still on the floor in my study, exactly where I had fallen only a few hours ago. I had no more time to ponder my curious circumstances, for outside in the courtyard and inside, echoing through the halls, I could hear the ringing of steel and the harsh cries of men bellowing both rage and agony. Clearly there was a battle raging all around me, and I rushed to the windows to determine what was happening. In the courtyard below, a small cluster of my knights had formed a defensive circle and were trying to fend off Visobian troops from all sides. The Visobians already had command of the guard towers beyond, and those in the courtyard outnumbered my men at least 4 to 1. My men were fighting well, but the position and the odds were hopeless. The ring of steel echoing through the halls meant that the Visobians must have already entered the keep. If they were inside, then this battle was already over. All that was left was the cleanup, and that's very likely what I was hearing now as the last of my men were being rooted out and killed. Suddenly, 2 Visobian soldiers burst into the room. What they saw must have confused them, for they froze in their tracks just 2 paces inside the doorway and looked blankly from Sir Thomas's body on the floor to me standing in front of the window. "Identify yourself," bellowed one of them. It was then that I first became aware that something about myself had changed. I didn't know what yet, but I started to notice little things. For starters, there were no candles burning in the room, and obviously they could not see me clearly enough to identify me. I must have appeared as nothing more than a dark silhouette in the moonlight to their eyes. Yet I could see perfectly, as though it was a sunny afternoon. From the ragged splint armor to the blade in his right hand, right down to the scraggly brown hair protruding from beneath his helmet. I also became aware of a scent I had never smelled before. Faint at first, but stronger and more obvious as I became aware of it. It was difficult to describe it exactly. It was sweet, but not like a flowery perfume. More like a pleasant earthy aroma that kind of hung in the air behind the pungent odor of sweat and grime emanating from these 2. The 2 men began to separate and approach me slowly from either flank as I remained still, lost in the new sensations that I seemed to be having. Even from a distance, I could clearly hear the rhythmic thumping of their hearts beating. A rhythm that began to quicken as they drew closer. I wasn't sure of it then, having never heard it before, but I've since heard a similar reaction thousands of times. They were scared, and the longer I remained silent, the more anxious they seemed to become. When they had reached either side of me, the surly one repeated his demand. "Identify yourself, or die," he added, trying to sound more confident now that he clearly felt he had an advantage. I opened my mouth to speak, but as my lips moved to form words, nothing came out. At the time, I didn't know why. Too stunned by my own silence, I did not have the wherewithal to move away from their attacks. Initially, I thought they'd missed me entirely, for I felt nothing. But looking down at myself, I saw that both swords were now buried in my chest. I suppose that to anyone not involved in this fight, it might have been comical to see all 3 of us just stand there, glancing at each other, then at the swords, then back at each other for a few moments. But it was such a bizarre thing that none of us seemed to know quite what to do next. Finally, they both withdrew their swords and took a step back. That sweet, earthy aroma in the room was now overpowering, and when I saw a few drops of blood drip from the end of their blades, I felt an all-consuming hunger come over me. Feed. That single word kept pounding in my mind. It was so powerful that I simply could not think of anything else. In a flash, I had knocked away the first man's sword, twisted his head to the side, and like a ravenous animal, sank my teeth into his exposed flesh. The wound I tore into his neck sent blood spraying everywhere. Just the thought of it now makes me cringe. So messy and so much wasted, but I hadn't yet learned to restrain myself. I cannot even begin to describe to you the sensations of that first meal. The euphoria, the power, the life that flooded my body as his blood flowed into me was... I suppose the ultimate physical sensation for humans is an orgasm, but having felt both, I can tell you that is a paltry thing next to this. The second man was initially stunned by the speed with which I had dispatched his colleague, but when he regained his senses, he did what I suppose was the only rational thing for him to do when faced with an enemy he did not know and clearly could not kill. He fled for the doorway as fast as he could. He did not make it. By the time the second body hit the floor, the hunger was not completely gone, but at least it was no longer overpowering, and my mind finally began to focus again. I knew I was not in the abyss, I knew now I never would be. It finally became clear what I had become, and a smile crossed my lips as I grabbed the fallen man's sword and calmly walked out of my study. These soldiers had come prepared to kill men. They were not at all prepared to do battle with the likes of me, and one after another Vesovian troops fell as I stalked the halls of the keep. The new power in my body was incredible. While I was certainly no weakling before, even I could not have done the things I found myself doing now. A small shove to disrupt an attack sent a fully armored man sailing through the room to crash against the far wall. A slight twist of my wrist when grappling with another snapped his neck like a small twig. Clearly, I was now far stronger than any mortal man could be, but it wasn't just the strength I had to get used to. As before, in the study, I found all my senses heightened. Torchlight or pure darkness seemed not to matter to my eyes. I could see quite clearly into the darkest shadows. I could sense people down the hallway or behind closed doors long before they were aware of me, and I moved with unearthly speed as though the world before me just froze in place. In no time at all, I had dispatched dozens of Vesovian soldiers as I stalked through the halls of the keep. I made my way out onto the walls and proceeded from tower to tower. By the time I had cleared out the last and descended into the courtyard below, there were very few of my own men left in that surrounded position I had seen from the window. What shock and horror my own men must have experienced as they witnessed the destruction I wrought. Blood showered the ground in buckets from the open wounds. The ring of steel on steel was frequently interrupted by the sound of bones crushing under my blows, and bodies flew as though an angry child was tossing dolls about her room. My men stood silently staring as the last of the Vesovians fell. "Magic," I heard someone whisper, and the others began to nod as they now thought they understood what had happened here. My men all knew that I dabbled in the arcane. It was hardly a secret, but it was one thing to wonder what magic can do. It is another thing entirely to see it with your own eyes. I didn't think it would help much to tell them how right and wrong they really were. Their stunned silence was eventually broken by screams of horror and rage bellowing out from the keep. Someone must have finally stumbled upon the grisly scene I had left behind during my exit. As I stood there watching my men panting with exhaustion, I finally realized why I had been unable to speak before. There was no air in my lungs to force out in order to form sounds, because I no longer breathed unless I forced myself to do so, and I felt a bit silly for not having realized that before. This problem worked out, my first new words were an order for the remaining knights to secure the gatehouse. "And raise the drawbridge," I added as I turned to enter the keep. "I beg your pardon, my lord." I turned to see Sir Lucas, the senior man left in the group. "But with the drawbridge raised, we'll have no way to escape." "Nor will they," I answered with a smile. Though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced it was a good idea, he did catch my meaning. He led the remaining knights toward the gatehouse to follow my orders, and I re-entered the keep to finish what I had started. With the bridge drawn up, no one could escape my wrath. What a gruesome sight it must have been as I entered the great hall. So covered with blood by now that I must have looked like little more than a crimson shadow to the Vesovian soldiers gathered there. They stood their ground, but already I could hear the quickening rhythm of 24 hearts gripped with fear as I calmly walked to the center of the room and waited for them to surround me. When they completed their circle, the room fell silent. Everyone seemed to be waiting. After a few moments, a man emerged from the door atop the grand staircase. I knew him not, but his ornate armor and flowing red cloak stood in stark contrast to the rest of us covered in dirt, sweat, and blood. This must be their commander. No common soldier could afford armor such as that. No soldier would want armor such as that, clearly designed more for appearance than function. "You are all that is left, soldier," he addressed me. "To judge by your appearance, you have fought bravely, but the battle is over. Your lord is dead. Your comrades are dead. Even the servants are dead. You stand alone, soldier. There is no one left to help you. Throw down your sword, and I will make this quick." Unlike his troops, his heartbeat was calm and steady. Clearly, he was not afraid. It was tempting to just tear them all apart as I had done to so many tonight, but with the drawbridge up, my men holding the gatehouse, and so few Vesovians left, I felt secure that there was no escape for them and decided to be naughty and play with my food, so to speak. If he was not afraid, perhaps I should remedy that first. I made a show of cautiously looking around the room at all the swords arrayed against me as though I had not noticed them before, and finally back to the man on the stairs with a look of defiance. Doing what I must say was some of my best acting, I lowered my eyes, slumped my shoulders, let the sword fall to the floor, and hung my head in defeat. I could feel the tension in the room ease as my blade clattered on the stone floor. The fear gripping the soldiers' hearts began to fade, and they were, if not completely at ease, at least less anxious. Their commander drew his dagger and began to descend the stairs toward me with an air of triumph in his step. I kept my eyes on the floor. When he finally came to a stop in front of me, he reached out with his dagger under my chin, forcing me to look up at him. I kept avoiding his eyes by looking side to side in an attempt to seem nervous about what we all knew was coming. This seemed to please him, as I saw the faint glimmer of a grin cross his face. He was gloating in his supposed triumph, and I suppose my apparent fear gave him the ego boost he seemed to crave so badly. He wanted everyone in the room to see him kill me in cold blood. It made him feel powerful. With a smile, he slowly and deliberately dragged the sharp blade across my throat. In an instant, his smile was gone, replaced by my own, as his eyes opened wide in disbelief. For a moment, I could see the shock in his expression as he tried to reconcile what he expected to happen with the reality before him. Blood did not pour freely from my neck. In fact, there was no wound at all. It had healed as quickly as he made it. I did not collapse to the floor and die at his feet, gasping for my last breath. I stood there, smiling back at him. I heard 24 hearts skip a beat when he thrust his dagger into my chest, and I still stood there smiling back at him as though nothing had happened. "You cannot kill me, sir," I said, staring directly into his eyes. I leaned forward a bit and added in but a whisper, "For I am already dead." That finally sent him over the edge. He was no longer shocked or confused. Now he was terrified. His heart raced as I plucked his dagger from my chest and plunged it into his own neck. You could taste the fear in the room by the time his body hit the floor. I dispatched the rest of them with little fanfare. Several were too petrified to even move. The battle now finished, I returned to the gatehouse. First, I dispatched riders to warn Count Sebastian in Wittich. If the Visobians had not already attacked, they would soon enough. The garrison there was never meant to stop an army, merely delay it long enough for my forces to reinforce them. Reinforcements they could no longer expect, as my forces now numbered so few men. The smart thing to do would be to surrender Wittich and withdraw his troops to a more defensible position in the Norgrim Pass. There he could perhaps delay the Visobian advance long enough for the Athlon army to join him. It would take a miracle, but I saw no other viable option. I also sent riders to Athila to warn the king. He needed to know that his preparations had failed. The Visobians were coming, and there was no longer force enough here to hold them in the pass. Athila found herself in the same desperate situation again. If he hoped to hold them in the pass, he'd better hurry. I sent more riders down to Dibblebird. The battle up here would not have gone unnoticed, and I'm sure chaos reigned in the village. If I did not send someone down with news, curious villagers would start coming up here to see for themselves, and I'd rather they didn't know how few men I had up here to protect them. Best to keep them calm. I had enough problems at the moment. A village gripped with fear and panic was the last thing I needed right now. I couldn't take the next step until I knew the situation downstream. I had to wait for the riders to return. For now, my attention turned to the personal. Celine, my love. The whole reason I had done all of this. There was no time for me to go to her. Even now I could see pale blue in the distant eastern sky beckoning the coming dawn. I felt a growing uneasiness creep into my body, and I knew that I must retreat from the light. I couldn't send anyone to bring her here without revealing my secret desire for her either. As much as my heart ached, I would have to wait. Looking around at my remaining knights, I knew I had to choose my words carefully. They did not know the truth of what had happened here tonight. They assumed it was magic, and it was, just not mine. If I told them, no, not an option. Nor could I leave them to think too much about it. They might arrive at some rather uncomfortable questions that I did not care to answer, so I chose to keep them busy. Search the keep, kill any who remain. After that, work in shifts stacking the bodies at the back of the courtyard, and rest as best you can. We're all going to need it. Cleaning up this mess would occupy them throughout the day. Do not disturb me until sundown, I said as I excused myself. I need to prepare. My first slumber as a new creature of the night, I didn't know what to expect, and I could not have them looking for me or discovering what I had become. Prepare was a sufficiently vague word. They would assume I meant to prepare more spells. Fear of strange magic would be enough to keep them from looking for me. While magic is not altogether uncommon in Etia, most regular people still have a healthy fear of it and try to avoid it as much as they can. Now, what about Asher? I had not seen him all night. Had he been killed in the battle before my awakening? Had he escaped during the confusion of those first few hours? Or was he still here, hiding like a coward? There was no time for me to run around looking for him. Find Asher, I added as the knights began to disperse and carry out my orders. If he's dead, so be it. If not, I want him alive. I'm sure they had no idea why I wanted him, but none questioned it. I woke that evening to the sound of boots shuffling on the stone and the muffled sounds of sobbing. The faintest scent of a flowery perfume drifted on the air, mixed with the deliciously sweet aroma I now knew was fresh blood. Someone had found their way into the dark halls of the crypts beneath the castle. The high pitch of the whimpers told me it was a woman, and the rapid beating of her heart told me she was terrified. I waited there when I spotted her creeping along the wall toward my chamber. There was no light down here, and she carried none, so I knew she could not see me. I did not know her, but her clothing marked her as one of the servant maids of the castle. She must have survived last night's massacre by hiding, and was now lost down here in the dark. I must admit to you that I regret what happened next. She was an innocent woman who deserved better, but I could not control myself. The hunger in me was too strong, and the scent of her blood too sweet to resist. When I had finished, I arranged her body in peaceful repose and left her there among the rest of the dead. I never even knew her name. With her life now flowing through me, I ascended from the crypts to my study. I took a few moments to clean myself up and put on fresh clothes. It was then that I was greeted with another surprise. Though I now looked a little pale standing there in the moonlight, my reflection in the mirror was still quite visible, and I began to wonder what other myths about my kind would turn out to be mere fables. "Come," I answered as I glided back to my desk. "Sire," Sir Lucas said as he opened the door and came in. "Ah, Captain Lucas." I could tell he was slightly taken aback by the sudden promotion, but with so few men at my disposal, it was hardly the honor it should have been. "Have you found Asher?" "I'm afraid not, my lord," he began. "His body was not among the dead, and we have searched the entire castle." Clearly they had not, considering they had not found me, but I decided not to mention that. Besides, if Asher had been in the crypts, I would have known with my newly heightened senses. He must have escaped at some point during the battle. The question now became slightly more complicated. Where had he gone, of course, but also, how much did he know? "The riders from Wittich have returned," he added. "The city has not been besieged. They delivered your advice to Count Sebastian, and he agreed. He will begin pulling his men back at daybreak, but he insisted on escorting the citizens out as well. That will slow him down, my lord." "As expected," I interrupted. "They are his responsibility, just as the villagers down there are ours." "I want you to do the same," I said. "Post watch in the gatehouse and get some sleep. At dawn, take the men down to the village and evacuate them to Athla. Guard them along the way, but keep a quick pace. The farther away from here you can get them, the safer they will be." "My lord," he questioned, "you mean to abandon the pass?" Lucas was a bright man, a veteran soldier. He understood the strategic advantage that would be lost if the Visobians marched through the pass onto the open plains of Athla. "No, Captain, I do not," I told him. "If Count Sebastian can withdraw his men here in good order, we will hold them long enough for General Bertal to mobilize." "Then we should stay with you, my lord," he said flatly. "We are few, but we are knights, sire. We will fight to the death by your side." "I know you would, Captain," I said with a reassuring smile. I knew the sentiment well. Knights of Athla never run from battle, and every man would indeed fight to the death if need be. But I heard Sir Kaladin's words in my mind. Pushing bad circumstances leads to bad results, he had taught me all those years ago. Right now, in this place, against these odds? No. It would be a useless gesture, and a pointless waste of the few good men that remained. Even if Sebastian could withdraw here, he could not hold this position against the whole of the Visobian army. This was goodbye, and Lucas knew it. "I will do what I can to delay them, Captain," I said, gesturing to the spellbook. "But you must make sure the villagers are safe, and tell General Bertal to hurry. You know he is a cautious man. He will wait for the whole army to assemble before committing to march. If you let him do that, it will be too late. Go over his head if you must, but force him to move quickly. Attila hangs in the balance." I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He did not like my orders. He knew what it meant, but he accepted them, and when dawn began to creep over the horizon, he carried them out as I once again fled into the dark. I did not realize it then, but I had just made a crucial mistake, and the next evening will haunt me forever.